we always think the crisis lead is the most important part because they're like the final decision maker. Very important. But what I've always noticed is it's a very underused role, and it's the room manager. So it's not somebody that is a leader per se that makes the decisions to respond to the crisis. It's the person that stands there that keeps the log boards, like what have we done, what actions do we need outstanding, keeping people on track, making sure that you said you were going to release that press statement at 12 o'clock. It's now 10 to 12. Is it ready? So that is the leader. That is the most important. That is a role that is so underutilized.
Welcome to Leadership Disrupted. Today we have with us Jon-Paul Gabriele, who specializes in high-stakes crisis communications, leadership readiness, and business continuity. I'm really excited about this conversation because whether it's cyber attacks or reputational crises or an operational disruption, Jon-Paul has led responses where every decision counts, and he's helped leadership teams navigate crisis through clarity. And on a personal level, one of the programs that I facilitate is called Strategic Leadership. And I was telling Jon-Paul in the pre-show that that program has always had a crisis response component to it, but it's always felt like a little bit not enough because, number one, it happens at the very end of the program. Imagine a 2-day leadership workshop, and at the end of the 2 days where you've covered all the aspects of strategic leadership development, lots of high-minded discussions, lots of strategy planning, et cetera. You have 2 hours at the end where you sort of tack on crisis response. And while it's a necessary part of the program, everybody's a little tired. And it's also felt to me like, this is content that they will really need someday. It might be in 6 months, it might be in a year, it might be at some point. And so they don't really need it now, they need it in the moment. And it really has not occurred to me that, I know there are crisis response consultants, but it's never really occurred to me that that's really the best time. Like in that moment where you need the learning, that just-in-time access to a credible consultant, to a credible expert, is probably exactly what most organizations need. So, Jon-Paul, first of all, I want to welcome you to the Leadership Disrupted podcast. This is going to be a great conversation and a little off the beaten path compared to some of our other conversations, which is fantastic. Is there any part of your background you'd like to perhaps fill us in with to give us a sense of the lay of the land for you before we dive deep into all things crisis response?
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity, Dan. Pleasure to speak with you. Bit of background about me. So, born and raised in the northeast of England, and my background is like professional career. I started with a degree in disaster management and emergency planning. So that's kind of where this whole career started from. Took an interest, wanted to be in the fire service, and then kind of found this course and think sounds fantastic. Ended up being a mixture from there with the public sector, with the NHS in Staffordshire in the UK. And then I moved between public sector and private sector doing crisis response. So I've been, I suppose fortunate's the wrong word, but fortunate and unfortunate enough to be involved in actual real crises, whether it be major fires, terrorist attacks, or corporate like cyber attacks and things. So I've also got the theory, but I've also been there and done it and been in the room with key decision makers. So I feel that puts me in a bit of a unique kind of mindset where there's few that have actually been in the trenches, so to speak. So hopefully that I can share some of that with you today.
It's interesting that you were interested in this from such an early part of your career, and actually seeking out a degree in crisis response or crisis management. I guess my first question is, I imagine there is crisis management best practices, the theory, and then there's what happens when you're actually on the ground and a crisis is occurring. Where do you see the biggest mismatch between what people think they're going to do, or how people think they're going to act or plan or execute in any way, and then what tends to actually happen on the ground in the absence of a good crisis management plan?
Time is the biggest one. So I think when you plan for a crisis, you're obviously sat there in like business as usual. So you have the time to think through what would we do, how would we do it, what's the kind of outcomes that may happen from that. What you find in reality is the time just goes by quick as a flash. So before you've even had time to even get the team together and try to think through what we'd have done, you potentially 1 or 2 hours into the crisis,
Mhm.
and then you're playing catch up. So I think the mismatch for me is the time element, and people you often find if you do a really good crisis simulation exercise well, you'll kind of have that same outcome as that went really fast. I didn't really have the
Yeah.
time to make the decisions that I thought I would have been able to do. I didn't think I'd have time to look through my plan. And you see it a lot of times, a lot of commentary and people in the industry is the plans are great, but they go out the window when a real crisis happens. And that is true to an extent, but I wouldn't say that we have to stop the planning phase because it's very important. But I think you can't sit down and read through a document when you're responding to a crisis. It really has to be that muscle memory and kind of get on with it.
Well, as I understand it, one of your specialities is scenario exercises, scenario planning in the crisis response context. And so I would imagine within those scenarios, if you can give people that sense of panic, like there's a time constraint, there's a time limitation, you must respond in some way uh, within X amount of time. That visceral experience of the time pressure might, I would imagine, be the best part of the learning experience, not necessarily the specific best practices that they ended up executing on, but learning to quickly accelerate. How do you find that?
That's completely right. And I think what else I'm a fan of is information overload because it's not. I think some crisis exercise that I've seen in the past are you get a piece of information and you have the time to deliberate and kind of come up with your answer, which is useful for I would say less mature teams that have never done it before.
Yeah,
But that's not how it happens in a real crisis, and you've got information overload, things coming from all directions. The phones are ringing, the emails are coming through, people are chatting, your higher ups are asking for an update. So what I love to do in my exercises is to give that information overload. So it's the time element, but also the feeling of loss of control. Because the more you get used to that feeling and that way of responding, the easier it becomes when you actually have to do it.
sure.
Because it's a case of you might have information that comes through. You've still got your day job to do as well, don't forget. So there's a lot of noise in a crisis that you have
Mhm.
to try and filter out, and also what's important and what can be paused, what can be passed off to somebody else. That's very difficult. So to simulate that as much as you can in an exercise, you really feel the benefit.
Uh, do you have any experiences in the real world where organizations who are experiencing a real crisis, they end up making decisions or taking actions that in hindsight they realize, oh, that was really not the right move, but under the pressure of time, we end up making those calls. Any examples like that you could share with us?
Yeah, a few. So I think one there was one example, a company I worked with, global company, and what there was actually the had it was a developing workplace violence type scenario. So somebody reported that they were being targeted by another colleague, repeated kind of pattern of behavior
Mhm.
that had just gone under the radar. And it kind of, as it does, it kind of let's see how it plays out. But it got to the point where the threats were becoming more and more aggressive and frequent. And what they didn't do at the time was actually say, well, do we need to actually have a response to this? And what happened was they actually came into the workplace with a weapon. So it turned into a much more violent situation that had happened. And the fact that they didn't have any kind of lockdown procedures, didn't have any kind of security on the front door, so it quickly escalated into a confrontation that
Mhm.
then had to be pulled apart, and emergency services were called, all that stuff. But what they realized was that they froze in that moment, the senior leadership team that were the crisis team, because they hadn't anticipated anything like that happening in the workplace to get to that level of extent. And I think that's what the learner came out with in the aftermath, and like when we had a debrief to say, well, what could we have done better here? And it was almost like it's far better to escalate something quickly and then de-escalate it again than trying to wait to see how something plays out, or just say, let's see how this works, and it might never happen. Far better to just get the resources together. They could have dealt with that and said, right, okay, let's either not let them come in today and let's get them mediation, all that kind of stuff. It could have prevented what could have been a very nasty or a fatal issue. So that's one extreme. And then the other extreme is when we see the cyber attacks that are coming more and more frequently now. And I think that's also a case of being able to understand the difference between what the technical teams are seeing and then what the key decision makers are seeing. That it's very, very much different levels and different skill sets and understanding. So I've seen and this has happened in multiple companies, where the technical teams are kind of dealing with a potential developing cyber attack and have never actually communicated that to the decision makers and the senior leaders until it gets to a point where it's like, okay, we think we've been attacked. By doing that, you're already in the middle of a crisis, and now the senior leaders are having to play catch up, and then the demands on the technical team become much, much higher because they're trying to get more information that they didn't have previously. So I guess what it boils down to, I'll give you two examples there, is that communication chain, and actually realizing at what point do we move from an incident to a crisis. And a lot of companies that I find don't really figure that part out. So it's what I would say as advice is to have that kind of threshold in a company of when does this become something that's beyond our control of a normal day-to-day or an incident, and when do we actually step that up a level and becomes a crisis? And so, like, at what point do we say, yes, let's get everybody together?
But if I'm hearing you right, not just burying the incidents, I mean, maintaining awareness that incidents are occurring, so that if suddenly something blooms into a true crisis, it's not a complete out of the blue surprise. In fact, you may have a sense of awareness that, in fact, these incidents, whether they're cyber attacks or even interpersonal incidents, even if they don't go to the extreme of violence, I do talk to a fair number of leaders when they've had situations where an incident between two employees or between a group of employees suddenly blows up, suddenly becomes a situation where someone's going to quit, or someone's going to be fired, or like this group just is not going to be able to work together in the same way because of the damage caused by whatever the disagreement might be. Generally, when you do a debrief of that, you can point to previous incidents that were I wouldn't say they weren't addressed. They were addressed, but they were sort of like Band-Aids. Hey, we'll just put this to bed, Band-Aid over this, without ever really addressing root causes. And then, not surprisingly, in some cases, at some point, things do blow up. Feelings do get hurt. People do get offended. Things are said. Sometimes things are done that seem unrecoverable. And then we think that was unpredictable. But in fact, it probably could have been predicted if you were paying closer attention to the incidents that were occurring. I wonder, the nature of a crisis almost is inherently unpredictability, because if you could predict it, well, then you would prepare for it, and then it wouldn't feel like a crisis. So I imagine most of the things that we call a crisis, there's something about them, even if it's, quote, a cyber attack, it's a cyber attack that's unique enough, that we weren't prepared, or we didn't think that we would have to worry about that particular aspect, whatever it might be. Can you talk a little bit about the nature of unpredictability in crisis management?
That's a great point, and that also touches to the difference between IT, disaster recovery, business continuity, and crisis. Is it in its nature is beyond the scope and the control of your normal decision making. So exactly what you point, and I think we see a lot of companies, or I've seen a lot of companies that will have 50, 60, 70-page plan that tries to account for every eventuality. Exactly right. You can't do that because you don't know what's going to happen. So with an IT failure, for example, you would have a run book. So to recover this system, I need to do A, B, C, D in this order. Otherwise, the service won't come back up again because I've not done it and built the bricks in the right order. You can't do that in a crisis because there's so many unknowns. There's so many different kind of mechanisms, different things pulling in all sorts of directions. So what you need to build is the capability to be adaptable enough to respond. So it's not so much that's why the plans are there as a crutch. And it's more, that's why I always say that the most important part is how do we get the crisis team assembled and who do we need to contact? And then the rest of it becomes the training that you fall back on from doing exercises. Yeah. So it's that getting people used to working together, pulling in the right direction, understanding the complexities and the different personalities in your team. Because that's another thing when we talk about like leadership, it's not always in a crisis. It's not always the top level that have to be the crisis management team and the crisis response team, because sometimes they're not the right personalities to do it. So you might actually find the people that are one level lower that have the right skills and the right capacity to be able to work under pressure as a unit. So they're the things that I say need to be the focus. It's not so much the planning for everything. It's the capability to say, okay, we've been hit by this curveball. Okay, let's adapt. Let's understand what we need to do. Let's move forward. And it's that as calm under pressure as you can be.
So that's really fascinating because I can imagine some organizations, consciously or not, that are somewhat top down in terms of their leadership culture, where you look to the person above you for direction in the midst of a particular kind of crisis, whether it's a safety crisis, a weather crisis, whatever the kind of crisis may be. What one would hope for is perhaps more bottom up, like those who are in the departments or in the functions that are most relevant to that particular crisis, stepping up to say, because they have the competence, they have the understanding, hoping that they will also have the leadership courage to step up to say, okay, Mr. CEO, Mr. Vice President, team of directors, great to have you here. Here's what we should do. Here's my recommendation. Here's my plan. Here's how we've been preparing for this. We would hope that those individuals rise up in the midst of a crisis. Does that happen frequently?
I'd say yes. It happens more than you would think, which is a good thing. And so I'd say you do get a lot of like department heads that become very effective in a crisis team for the reasons that you said there. They understand their area, they understand what needs to be done. Where the difficulties might lie is that taking that final decision of, shall we press the buttons, shall we activate, shall we notify this person? And that's why that very top level is because it's when you went back with the introduction at the start, it's you almost have that reluctance to say, well, if I make this decision, it's going to come back on me if it goes wrong. So they might have all the best intentions, all of the knowledge will get you to a point, but that when that final decision comes, that's where it's a bit like, okay, that's not for me now. That needs to go up the chain, and that's what you tend to see. Not everywhere. There are some companies that are very effective and will make the decision and stand by it. So then it goes back to the training on that as well, where you have to give them the confidence and the authority to say, you're making a decision on behalf of the company. Yeah, the more often than not, very, very big decisions and big calls to make. But if you have gone through training and you've got the documentation and you've documented why you've made the decision, if it is the wrong decision when it comes out in the wash, then you can stand by the fact that I made that decision at the time with the information that I had available.
Yeah.
Because there's never a good time to make these kind of decisions, and you're never going to have all of the information. Otherwise, if you wait for it, it's going to get 10 times worse before it gets any better. So giving them that, yeah.
And I think if a leader is very clear on his or her hierarchy of priorities, hierarchy of loyalties, if it's very clear in your own mind that you Your hierarchy of priority starts with, and I'm just making this up, but starts with your community first, then your employees, then your customers, then your board of directors, and then your bottom line. That will lead you towards one set of decisions. And if though, because of the way perhaps you are built or the way you were raised as a leader, your hierarchy is start with your board of directors and then your investors, and then you like almost the opposite, where you start with the business priorities and then move your way down, you will hesitate. You'll ask yourself, is now the time to issue a press release? Is now the time to shut down that equipment? Is now the time to take these decisions? And you will hesitate and struggle to take accountability for those decisions. Whereas if your hierarchy of loyalty was flipped around, it would be very clear. Now, I know every situation is different, so I don't necessarily want to say it should always be one way or the other. But I do find that under pressure, even if it's not crisis pressure, if it's just under business pressure, leaders who have a fuzzy sense of that hierarchy for themselves really struggle, because they're trying to balance self-interest with the interest of investors, board of directors, employees, customers, community. So I love it when you see a leader under pressure who's able to move very quickly, because there's simply no question for her or him. He or she knows themselves, they know their hierarchy, and they're able to say, okay, there may be a price to pay, but we have to do right by this group and then this group and then this group. So we're going to press the button, and then we're going to learn from that, and then we're going to keep moving forward. How often do you see leaders rise up and become more in the face of a crisis versus leaders who perhaps crumble a bit in the face of a crisis?
I've seen more where they've risen to the occasion, and that's it. Where they just, I need to get on and do it. What you need from me, and sometimes it's a good thing, but sometimes it can be a negative as well, because you get a lot of people with the best intentions wanting to help and wanting to help with the response, but then you've got too many people, that there's too many voices and there's too much going on. So sometimes you just need that kind of one decisive voice rather than a lot of good intentioned people. But I have also seen it the other way, where you've seen it where the whole room has just been silent and everyone's just sat there looking at each other. And it's that first part is who's kicking off the conversation. Once you get past that kicking off the conversation, it tends to get into a bit of a rhythm. But you can almost have that like shell shock when everyone gets there, whether it be a virtual room or in a physical room. And the one role that I've always said, and that I've noticed this across my career, we always think the crisis lead is the most important part, because they're like the final decision maker. Very important. But what I've always noticed is it's a very underused role, and it's the room manager. So it's not somebody that is a leader per se that makes the decisions to respond to the crisis. It's the person that stands there that keeps the log boards, like what have we done, what actions do we need outstanding, keeping people on track, making sure that you said you were going to release that press statement at 12 o'clock. It's now 10 to 12. Is it ready? So that is the leader. That is the most important. That is a role that is so underutilized. But what it does is it takes so much pressure away from the decision makers, that they've now got a clear focus to say, we have to make the decisions. We don't have to worry about logging it to tell this person, to tell this person. That one person or two people in the room have that covered. So leadership from that perspective, I think, is so valuable. And that's not always a senior person. It's just a very strong person that can actually say to a CEO or a senior leader, stop, you're going down a rabbit hole here. You blinkered views. We need to stop. Let's pause. Let's look back at the board. And that's a scary thing to do when you're in a room of senior people. But I've seen some very strong people in that role, and it's turned what could have been a poor crisis response into a really strong crisis response just from that role.
Do you have any organizations where they actually have pre-assigned that particular role, where they will say, you may not necessarily own the response, but you own the process of coming up with the response. So there's no question that the first voice we will hear whenever this meeting might come up, it might not be for 6 years, but whenever this comes up, the first voice we will hear is yours, because you will remind us of, here's our process, here's step number one, and you will at least kick things off and then keep us on track.
Yes.
Do you ever serve in that role as a crisis management consultant? Is that ever on your shoulders?
Yes, it can be, and I've had that. So a company I worked with previously, when I was a consultant, and it was for the Manchester terrorist attack with the Ariana Grande concert, and they'd brought me in as a consultant to develop their team. Brilliant team, very effective. But what they needed was just that person that was to kick things off and kind of coordinate the response. And that was my role, like they said. So it was the middle of the night. So, right, okay, I rang the crisis lead and I said, okay, what we're doing here, I think I advise you that we activate the team. Completely agree. So then we sent the message out. We used a notification tool, got everyone on a call, started the response, and then it was my role then to make sure that are you looking at your agenda? Are you looking at your plans? Have you notified your staff? Have you found everyone accountable? It turned out that they had somebody that was at the concert that worked for the company, so welfare checks and all that kind of stuff. And that was my role, is just to coordinate the response and be in the background, pulling the strings in a way, just giving the rest of the team the ability to just be able to think on the response elements. And again, it worked very well on that case. And you do find that you've got a lot of in-house people. Like crisis management and business continuity is a very prominent role now in a lot of companies, for various reasons. But that role tends to be the kicking it off, and then they take a step back, or they become that room manager in the logist, and they won't necessarily lead the entire response. That's more like the senior leadership team.
So I know that your organization, Crisis City, does crisis response training, for lack of a better word, and a lot of it is scenario based. Are the scenarios, do they tend toward creating custom scenarios that are very specific to a client organization's situation or context, or are they more, I'll use the word generic, or universal scenarios where their groups will be thrown into a situation with which they're not familiar at all, and they have to figure things out? I mean, how does it typically work? Walk us through what it would look like to work with Crisis City.
So to start with, we'd have like an initial kickoff call, and they're the questions that I would ask straight away is, what is it that you want to get out of your exercise? How far can we push your team? Because some don't want to be pushed to the level. I'll always advise it, because I feel like that's the best way to learn. But if they're quite a new team, you don't want to overbear someone, and it's like, okay, well, we need to run another one and make it a bit more dynamic. But then I'd say, do you want something that is specific, written for your company, in which we'll write a bespoke exercise that is for their industry, for their region that they're in, and very, very specific for, it might be something that they've had a near miss on, or something that their exec team are a bit nervous about. So one of the questions is, what keeps you up at night? And like a lot of it is AI, deepfakes for the executives. We get that quite a lot at the minute. But there's also value, is I say, well, do you want something that's completely off the cuff? Because there's the value in that is it takes their view of, well, this is how the company runs, and it takes all that away. And it's just like, let's build up your crisis response capability outside of the kind of restrictions of your business as usual operating procedures. So that can work really well. It just needs the engagement and the kind of, everybody has to be pulling in the right direction with that. Because sometimes you can get some dissenting voices to say, oh, that's not realistic, that would never happen to us. So that can almost derail an exercise. You've got to understand who you're working with as well, and what their culture is like. So that's what I would try to gauge first before I make any recommendations.
Well, and back to the issue of unpredictability, if you're trying to prepare people for the unpredictable, if your scenario is too much in alignment with our current systems, our current market, our current environment, Not that that's bad, but some individuals, but because of their experience, because of their expertise, may be able to kind of smooth their way through your scenario, built because of everything that they've already got. Whereas if you throw them into something completely unknown or unprepared for them, the environment, the systems, the processes, everything, all they have to rely on then is their ability to react to the unpredictable, and they'll have to figure things out based upon that. I could see both the value of that and the anxiety-inducing nature of that. If you're thrown into a situation, you have no reference experience, and you have limited time, limited resources, and the stakes are very high. Stakes are high. What I do find, not in crisis response, because I don't run those kinds of scenarios, but I run negotiating scenarios that are very real, but also very sort of open architecture, not based upon the specifics of the business. I'm amazed at how people, what's the right word? They fall into the scenario very quickly. It becomes real to them. It doesn't take much. Suspension of disbelief. Their disbelief gets suspended very quickly, and suddenly they are in it, to the point where their frustrations are real, their tension is real, their anxiety is real, which I imagine that's what you want. You want to build that muscle of how to react when something occurs that you could not have predicted.
Absolutely, yeah. The worst kind of exercises that you can run is where it's like you can almost, exactly what you said, you can almost guess your way through, and it's like, oh, that was a great answer, or that was a weak answer, and it's like, well, okay, that's no benefit to a team, because it's like it's obvious the path that the exercise is trying to take you to. So I'm a big fan of having multiple crises. So it's like you're in the middle of like dealing with a fire in a warehouse, for example. Then all of a sudden you have a pandemic on top of it, or you have a riot, or a mass staff shortage. So you're then pulling the team in a different direction when they were like all full steam ahead trying to deal with one crisis. Or you think it's something, and then all of a sudden it shifts, and it was something that was completely irrelevant that you've just spent an hour trying to deal with. So all those little things to make into an exercise where you just keep them guessing. Have phone calls coming in. Rich media is a really big thing, and you can do some amazing things now. We do a lot of like video and audio that just immerse people in it, and it's like, oh my goodness, feels real. And it's so valuable to do that, because they're not just sat around a table with a nice cup of coffee and thinking, yeah, I do that. There's no value to that. You need to make them sweat. And you need to.
I would imagine for some of your client organizations, this might be like an annual thing. Instead of the annual team building get together or the annual whatever, I would imagine once a year getting together for a scenario like this would be a really good preparation. Hopefully it's never necessary, but if you've done it every year for 3 years and then suddenly something happens, you'd feel like you're a lot better prepared. Do you have any clients who make it like a regular part of their organizational development?
Yes, the majority of clients now will do at least a year, like an annual exercise. Some even more now, and that's because they get so much value out of the exercise, which is a plus point. But there's a few factors. One, it's becoming more of a regulatory requirement now for a lot of industries. It used to just be the financial sector because it was so heavily regulated, but that's coming across multiple industries now, where you have to exercise, you have to demonstrate your supply chain. You've got to demonstrate the supply chain that you're resilient. So you have to do it. But then you have other companies that want to do it because they want that resilience and to make sure that they do it. But the annual, you could have a program. It's all well and good testing your key personnel and doing an exercise, but you'll know as well as I do that how often are that your senior leaders and your execs all in the same place, all available at the same time. They're traveling, they're in back-to-back meetings, they're not contactable. So you need to kind of test that second level down, the deputies, and even if you want to go further, like your tertiary backups, that could also step in to run a crisis if your primary people aren't there. And that's even harder because they almost feel that I don't have the authority to make these decisions. But actually, if they're not available, you have to make them
Oh,
decisions.
that would be hugely revelatory if you had a scenario where at various points key people simply are gone. For
Yes.
for whatever reason you create, they're gone. And we're still in the scenario. Someone's got to decide, someone's got to move. That would help to like peel the layers away and help to reveal what's really happening within your organization. That's amazing.
Yeah, we've done them in the past where it's just like they might all be sat there, and you just say, you just take them out. You've got to go out the room, and okay, they've been called away, and it can completely shift the dynamic
Yeah.
of the whole room, and it really works well. I like it if they're a disruptive person, or you tell that they're not engaged. Okay, you go away. Let's see if this changes anything, and you can bring them back. But sometimes that will also help you as a facilitator run an exercise to say, okay, like you need to go. Like you've been called away. You're traveling for work. You're part of the crisis. You're not able to respond, and it really affects the momentum quite well as well.
What are some of the major revelations? I imagine, every time you do a scenario like this, you debrief,
Yes.
and then people talk about lessons learned and what are we going to take forward with us to apply in the future. What would you consider to be the most common lessons learned from those debriefs?
It's actually far less common than you'd think. Debriefs,
Okay.
for me, it's the most important part. But there's been so many like exercises where you finish an exercise, pat everyone on the back, didn't we do great? Or you might have a 5 minutes kind of wash up session. That's not a debrief. So it happens far less frequently than it really should, whether that be in a real crisis
Yeah.
or in an exercise. So it's invaluable to spend the time to say, well, what was the point of that? Did we meet our objectives? How did we respond? But have the uncomfortable conversations as well, not just what went well. Where did we fail? What could have, if this was real, where would we have been in a reputational disaster potentially on the back of this? So the learning outcomes of a debrief for me is looking at the good is fine, excellent, but where do we identify the gaps and what are we going to do about them? And a lot of it is either the documentation needs updating, which is fine, but a lot of it is we were too slow to make the decisions, and that's what it boils down to from what I've seen personally is we felt like it took a while for us to get into our rhythm. By the time we had, the exercise was finished, and you have to sometimes adapt your exercise because of that. And that's something that I'll always pick is you were half an hour, 45 minutes into the exercise, and you hadn't actually done anything. You're just talking, and nobody did anything. You haven't got that luxury in a crisis, particularly with social media and everything. Now it's got away with you before you've even got to that point. So, and what I always like to say is it's lessons identified rather than learned at this point, because you've got to go away and do a lot of work on the back end before you've actually learned from what you've achieved. It's like, okay, we need to go away and do this now. What we're going to do before we learn it. And there's something that I learned from working in the emergency services is you've got a hot wash straight after the exercise, and then a debrief perhaps a week or so afterwards, so people have had time to reflect. So then you get like the immediate anxiety and kind of this was stupid, or we didn't do this, and how could we have missed that? And then they go away and reflect, and then you have a bit more of a considered discussion around the table. So I would always do two personally.
I do think it speaks to the importance, ideally, of having someone from the outside who can facilitate that kind of conversation, someone who is motivated to go toward the discomfort, who's motivated to not just wrap a bow around it and say, wasn't this a great bonding experience, but actually explore, why did it take so long? How did you get to that decision? What might have been some of the implications that you aren't currently considering regarding whatever happened? The learning really comes from that discomfort, I would think, but most organizations won't go there naturally themselves. They will instead kind of wrap up, pat each other on the back. The other thing that I think is important, I would imagine, is having that culture of open communication where no one feels threatened by the authentic debrief, by if where someone who recognizes, you know what, I took 10 minutes too long to make that call, or you know what, I realize now I kind of mucked up the works because I took us on a couple of tangents that we shouldn't have gone on, or what as people realize what I could have done differently or better, willingness to express that, willingness to share openly what did and didn't work ideally. That's maybe rare is not the right word, but it's less common than we would like it to be. I would imagine, to feel like, okay, let's air our dirty laundry and learn from it, because you can't, I'll mix my metaphors. You can't pull weeds from your garden if you don't know that your garden has weeds, or you don't acknowledge that your garden has weeds. So when you have organizations like your current client base, and they do go through a debrief and they've learned a bit, what lessons have you learned? Like, as you now have been able to see crisis response from a training standpoint, from a real world standpoint, as the employee crisis management person, and from the real world standpoint as someone external, being more of an observer, as you think about what you've learned in this field, what are the, I guess, big lessons that bubble up to the top of your mind?
Two big things. One is you've got to leave your ego at the door, and that's easier said than done, particularly at the level that would be making those decisions. But you've got to be able to take criticism, and that's very difficult, but also give criticism. And the other one is documentation, and that's something I learned the hard way previously. So when I worked, it was the civil contingencies unit. So it was like a central coordination unit for police, fire, ambulance, local authority. So we would do, for major incidents, we would help coordinate like a one that would encompass all of those different emergency services. And for that, we had to be on call. So you'd be on call middle of the night, you'd get a pager, and you've got to try and respond.
Mm-hmm.
And you get a lot of information by phone call to say, well, this is where it is, this is what's happening, this is the information and the resources that I need. And I learned the hard way, if you don't write that down when you get off the phone and you've forgotten half of it, that's an awkward conversation to ring them back and think, sorry, what did you say? Because they're at the scene, they're trying to respond to something, and they've told you everything and gone off to do what they need to do. And so it's not a good look, and I had to do it. I'm really sorry, I didn't catch what you said. And I got my knuckles wrapped around it, because it's like, that's not good enough. And it wasn't. Mm-hmm. But then that's what I brought forward from that, is that's the same whether you're in the emergency services or you're in business. Crisis response, if you don't log everything that you've done, decisions, actions, timestamps, because if it goes to court, if it goes for insurance premiums, if it's the debrief that's a couple of weeks after, to try and remember from your brain, you'll forget instantly, because it's the adrenaline's worn off. So you need that record of, okay, I did this at this time, and you've got a clear event of what happened, and it builds that timeline. And I'd hate if you had to be on, if it went to an inquest and you had to stand up in court and say, well, why did you make that decision?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, because I just did it at the time. I would not like to have to be in that position. Or if you say, I did it because I had this information, that's what I had at the time, I spoke with this person, we decided at this time, we made this decision. Okay, turned out it was the wrong one, but
even if it's the wrong one, if we can follow your logic chain in the moment to say, I knew this and this and this, I made this call. Okay, it turns out it was not the right call, but there was a logic chain. I think that's much better than to say, well, I just made the call.
Yes, exactly. Hindsight's a wonderful thing, and that's why when people on the outside look at how companies respond to a crisis and said, oh, they made some mistakes there, I would never have done that, how stupid of them. You weren't there. Like, you weren't in the throes. You didn't
Yeah.
know how much information or how little information they had at the time. So I've got a lot of sympathy for a lot of like companies that go through a crisis because they get criticized, outsiders looking in. So okay, we didn't have the information that you have to
Yeah.
criticize us with at the time. We had to do something. And so if it's a wrong, but exactly like you said, it might have been the wrong decision, but it was the right decision at the time.
Once everything settles and you know how everything worked out, it's got to be so easy in your mind to create what the right path would have been, and to even convince yourself that you're not biased, but you are. You're because you're recognizing where this ended up. But that goes back to the beauty of training for unpredictability. I would, if there was ever a job of creating unpredictable scenarios, I would love to have that job. I would love to create situations and scenarios where people they think things are going one way, and instead of zigging, we zag, and then instead of zagging, we zog, I just think that would be fascinating to observe people, and even to experience it would be fascinating. I want to be respectful of your time, but I have two more questions. One is more puerile in my interest. Do you have any particularly bad example of an organization? And you can feel free to anonymize it. You don't have to necessarily name names, but like a really just awful example of an organization that wasn't prepared and they ended up really not doing well in crisis response?
I do, yes. And it kind of built up over time. So it was again, global company. There were the where I was the US, in Texas. I was there, and we battled with them and battled with them for months to say you've got to do an exercise, you've got to build your plans. And there was this one person just like, no, don't see the point. We'll figure it out at the time. We're good at this. We'll manage, and we're just disruptive. But they had so much influence that then that filtered down to everybody else. So nobody wanted to entertain me. I'd go to the site, obviously flying from the UK. I'd go to the site. Nobody would want to speak to me. And then it got to the point where, okay, something's going to happen and you're not going to be prepared. And it did. And they had this crisis and it affected their whole office. And it shut down. And they were a company that couldn't have no downtime. So they worked in like financial services, could have no downtime. And they did, because the whole computer systems went down and they didn't have a clue what to do. And that same phone call I got from the person who had no interest in entertaining me called me up and said, we need your help. What do we do? Where's our plans? You should have written these, and tried to blame me for doing it. It's like, okay. But then you've got to be professional and say, right, forget again, put your ego at the door. What do we need to do? So I said, look, get everyone on a call. Let's work through this. And we had to just kind of muddle our way through. But he just flew by the seat of his pants, and he just sat there, and he was the key decision maker, and he just did not have a clue what to do. And in the end, we just kind of had to leave him out of it, because if we didn't, like the financial loss of their downtime went into the millions very, very quickly. And it was all because they didn't do the regular patching of their IT systems. And again, because it was like, we don't need to do this. We've got this. I don't see the benefit. I'm not spending the cost on having to do this. And it was very much of that case of nothing will ever happen. And it did. And he was under the cosh from that point of view. But yeah, it was quite funny when I got that phone call, because I mean, I had every right to say, you're on your own. Professional integrity, I didn't. But it was one of those cases of like, I told you so. And it could have been.
It's one of the hair shirts that consultants have to wear, because it's easy to lean toward the consultant and say, you should have. Why didn't you? Why aren't we? And to try to blame the consultants. When you think about our world in general, I mean, crisis management has been in existence for 2,000 years. People, since humans have always been managing their crises. And I imagine, because this is your world, if your point of view can skew maybe a little more toward cynicism, skepticism, worry, but even with that in mind, are you seeing our world shift toward more potential for more crises, whether they are technical in nature, interpersonal in nature, violence in nature, economic or environmental, whatever. I'm not sure if it's real or just my perception driven by social media and news and information and misinformation. I have this perception that our world is getting more anti-fragile. No, I'm sorry, less anti-fragile, more brittle. Our world is getting more brittle, and it doesn't take much to snap. Is that a perception thing, or does that feel to you more like reality, that our world is becoming more brittle?
I think that is the reality now, and it's unfortunate to have to say it, but I think social media doesn't help in the slightest, because you go and it's just constant doom, and we're in a poly crisis now. And for that, it's like there's multiple crises happening at the same time, consistently. Like you feel like you just get past one and then something else happens. It's like, what's next? So I think as a like across the globe, everyone feels just defeated at the minute. It's just like, well, everyone's just fatigued. We got through COVID, and then with all the political unrest, and then what's happening now. It's just, well, what's next? What's next? What's next? So I think we are much more fragile, and I think because the patience is so thin now.
Yeah.
So I think it's almost like when with children, where they get very upset very quickly over something that's not as important as it would have been. And I think that's not to trivialize anything, but I think we see so many people will kind of go from 0 to 100 much quicker than they would have done previously, because we've had to put up with so much over the last 10, 15, 20 years. But I think social media just really doesn't help. And
Yeah.
it's awful, because I'm in the industry, so but you find and think, well, do I believe that? Do I not believe that? With AI, it's so difficult now to try, and you've really got to look. Whereas before with AI, like a year or so ago, very easy to say, well, that's clearly an AI video. You're seeing companies now that are being duped out of hundreds of thousands of pounds, millions of pounds, because they're on a Zoom call with somebody that's not real. And so it's those things where people trust and it's just gone, unfortunately. And I think it's going to struggle to get it back.
And that particular arena of fraud is getting so much more effective. About once a month now, I either receive a text message or a Teams chat message from the CEO of our company, and it's not the CEO of our company.
Yeah.
And somehow my mobile number got on somebody's list somewhere, and my email got on somebody's list somewhere, and I've learned to, luckily, discern when this person is asking for something that the CEO would never actually ask for. But it must be working, because just because it doesn't work with me doesn't mean, in today's world, you can do something, and as long as you get a hit rate of 1 out of 1,000, 1 out of 5,000, 1 out of 10,000 will be fine. That 10,000 will be profitable enough to make you what you want to make, and cause horrible havoc for the organization.
Right. Yeah.
So I do agree. We're entering a world where crises are more common, and then the downside of crises is more deep or more steep, where it only takes one employee with a social media profile. It only takes one employee with access to some data. It only takes one person with the wrong intent to create havoc. Now, I know that many crisis response organizations or crisis preparedness, they try to protect the system so that there isn't vulnerability to a single employee, which is great. But I think for many of us, we know that if we had a single employee with the wrong intent, given the way systems work currently, that employee could cause a lot of damage in a fairly short period of time.
Absolutely.
So I asked you about worst case or examples. Is there anyone that you would call really the prime example of excellent preparedness, excellent or actual response. Like any great example of organizations that really responded effectively in the midst of an unpredictable crisis?
I think there's a few, and I think probably rather than talk about individuals, like the commonalities is good, effective communications really helps, and it's the empathy that you show and ownership of it. Especially if you go, I think Marks and Spencer, it would be a good one with the cyber attack that they had
Mhm.
last year. Really wide scale, long issue, but the fact that they communicated with empathy and they said, "Look, we owned it. This has happened. We're dealing with it. We're taking these steps," and then they continued to communicate in stages after that. And they didn't bury their head in the sand. And I think that that's the most important part. And a lot of companies where you see it's successful do that. And I think with a crisis, it doesn't. It's a negative connotation when you always say it's a crisis. It's a crisis. You can have a lot of opportunity and good outcomes that come from a crisis. It doesn't always have to be negative. The start of it is obviously negative, otherwise it wouldn't be a crisis.
Sure.
But if you communicate effectively, you're open and honest, you take the steps necessary, people are more forgiving of that than they are when they just go radio silent or say the wrong thing or try to be funny when that's not the time or the place
Mhm.
to be funny. So having your communications practiced, rehearsed, but not robotic as well. That human element is what people want to see. And I think that's where you've got to engage in a crisis. You've got to engage with the person that you're trying to talk to, not talk down to them, not belittle them, not talk corporate speak. You've got to be real and say, we're sorry. And that's so important, is to maintain that integrity and that empathy, because that will help you in the long run. And if you look back on crisis, like successful crises, it has been that communication with your stakeholders, not just your external ones, internally as well. A lot of companies will forget about the staff during a crisis, and they'll say, we've got to talk to our customers, we've got to talk to our shareholders. Remember your staff, because they're the ones that you have to look after. They're the
Yeah.
ones that will be there when everything's finished. And a lot of companies will forget about that, or there'll be an afterthought. Well, you're just prolonging everything because staff will get disgruntled. Well, they're not telling us everything. We're having to hear things from press releases or from the media. So they're the two things I would say, is your external and your internal comms. Is
Well,
that
and
way?
that sounds like a huge lesson, because I know that most leaders develop a certain set point in terms of the amount of context they provide to their employees and their organization. In a non-crisis situation, you sort of you get used to explaining things to a certain degree, but you don't go deeper than that because you just don't have time to go deeper than that. And you can do that over the months, over the years. And so you have this set point of what makes sense to you when you can say, yeah, I explained this to them because you explained it to a certain depth.
Mhm.
And one can forget that in the midst of a crisis, most people, their need for information suddenly goes deeper. They want more context. They want more explanation. They want to understand what's behind the curtain, not just what's in front of the curtain. And leaders who aren't used to that or aren't conscious of it may find themselves thinking they've explained it. I told them what happened and why and what we're going to do. And they don't have that sensitivity to how much context people really need. And then they'll get surprised. They'll go to an employee town hall or Q&A session or an online Q&A, and they'll get peppered with questions that go much deeper than they expected. And rather than having empathy for that, they will get impatient. And then I've seen it. I've seen it relatively recently. A CEO shut down an employee Q&A because he didn't like the questions. He felt they were going too deep. But instead of empathizing with the fact that my employees are scared, they're nervous, they need to know more and deeper than what I typically have delivered in the past. But that leadership empathy for your constituents, for your stakeholders, for your employees, for your customers, for your community, for your board, empathy for all of those constituencies in the midst of a crisis, man, that's a high bar. I mean, you're asking for a high level of leadership where someone can be on and speedily make the decisions that need to be made and still understand how others are perceiving that crisis situation. You work in a fascinating arena, Jon-Paul, and I have to imagine if anybody wants to reach out to you for further information, I'll make sure that we have links to your website and to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes, so you can definitely go there if you're interested in learning more or engaging with Jon-Paul in any way or having a conversation. Any final words you'd like to share with us before we wrap up?
Well, first of all, thank you. I've really enjoyed that. But I think just the most important thing is just this will happen. So I think that it's regardless of whatever role you play in an organization, be aware of crisis response and just start to think, how would I respond to this if it was me? Because it's not just your business. Think of your personal life as well, and just that preparedness. It's not scare tactics that I'm trying to push here. It's just having that, build that resilience within you and then within the companies that you work for.
My wife would love hearing you say that, because she's always saying to me, we should at least contemplate. We should at least consider. We should think through, what would we do if? And I am the one saying, you know what? That's not likely. That's not likely. That's not likely. But any one of those things may not be likely. But what is likely is that one of those many things may in fact happen at some point in the not too distant future. And at the very least, if you've thought through and talked through how one might respond, what harm? I mean, you're simply better prepared.
That's right.
Jon-Paul, thank you. This is a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And like I said, if you are interested in learning more, reach out, go to the show notes, and you'll get the contact information. Thank you. Much appreciated.
Pleasure. Thank you very much.